What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the first-person shooter tutorial series, we are going to be going over melee attacks part 2. So if we come into our game here, we can walk up to an opponent, perform a melee attack, and we will defeat the opponent. Now, if I just walk up to an opponent, of course I'm not damaging them, I have to be within the animation, and the animation has to actually collide with the opponent, or rather a collision box that we make is going to collide with the opponent. We can, of course, customize our damage to determine how much we actually do to the enemy and our distance, because right here, it looks to me like I should be able to hit the enemy, but I'm not. And we're going to show that in the episode, how to adjust that range. But anyway, that's what we're going to be covering today. If you want to get caught up in the series before checking out the melee episodes, so you can see how we've done things like projectiles, damage numbers, and interacting with objects in the world, then you can click this link in the top right corner right here to check out the entire playlist of the first-person shooter tutorial series. Alternatively, if you don't care about that and you just care about your melee, I do recommend you watch the previous episode of this series, which is the melee episode. That's how we actually press a button to perform the animation and exit back to idle once that animation is finished. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to be doing almost everything in the code today. So go ahead and hop over to your C++. The first thing we want to do is go to our FPS tutorial character.h. If we scroll down in here to our components, I want to add a new component which is going to represent our melee box. So at the very bottom here, I have my character mesh and my first-person camera component. I'm adding a new one that is of type uBox component. So class uBox component pointer, and I'm calling it the melee collision component. I've made it a U property of visible anywhere, blueprint read only, to mimic my other components that I have. I've given it a category of melee, and meta allow private access equals true. Right now it's in public, but my other components had it, and I wanted to make it the same here so that all of our components are following the same structure. If we ever move this to a private scope, we will still be able to access this. Additionally, I'm going to put my categories in quotes because I think it looks better, and I did not do that for my other components. This is not required, but I do like this, and again, I'm trying to stay consistent. So uBox component is basically just a box or a square or a cube that we can put on our character and really do whatever we want with it. In this case, we're going to be checking to see if any objects are overlapping with that box component, and if they are, we're going to damage them. So basically, if we perform an attack, we activate our box component. Once our box component is activated, if it is overlapping with an enemy, we are going to deal damage to the enemy. We say class here, so we don't have to include it in the header file. There's nothing wrong with including it in the header file here. This is just a standard way for Unreal templates with their components, and I followed that behavior this whole way, but feel free to customize it to your liking. Regardless, we have our melee collision component. That's what we're going to need. So let's go into our FPS tutorial character.cpp, and in the constructor with our other components, I have this setup component section here. I've now added 3 new lines for our melee collision component. So the first one is going to be creating the actual object off of this component. So when we create it, we will be able to see it and edit it within the blueprint. We'll also be able to actually have it attached to our character at this point. So melee collision component equals create default subobject. The type is uBox component. You see it's in these angled brackets. And for the name of it, I called it melee collision. We have to put it in this text macro here so that everything on Unreal side for this create default subobject is actually set up correctly. That's why we have that text macro. And again, this is the name. So whatever you call it here is what's going to show up as in the blueprint and just the tree in general on the character. Then additionally, we want to actually attach it, like I mentioned earlier. So melee collision component, setup attachment, and we're going to attach it to the capsule component. If we call get capsule component, it just returns the capsule component of the character. This is the root of all characters in Unreal. So basically we're attaching it to the root. You could attach it to another component you had if you wanted, but we don't need to do that. Then I'm going to disable collision on it by default because we only want to track collisions on the melee collision component when we're actually performing a melee attack, not just anytime we walk into them. Otherwise, if we walked close enough to an enemy, we would deal damage to them, which of course is not right. So melee collision component, set collision enabled, and for the type, we're going to use eCollision enabled, : no collision. Basically, we're just disabling collision with this component. Now, to actually use this box collision or this box component in the code, even though we had the forward declaration in the .h file, when we're using it here, we need to include it in the CPP. So when we do this, we do include component / box component.h, and that will allow you to modify the box component and create the sub-object using that type right here. There's something else we're going to do here too, which is binding the onComponentBegin overlap function that you might have seen in blueprints or other sections of code where an overlap event actually occurs between this component and another object. And once an overlap occurs, we're going to call this function right here. Now, we don't have this function yet. So next thing we need to do is make a function to handle an actual overlap collision between this component and another object. First things first, let's scroll down to where we want to make this function. So we have our melee function, and I put it right under that. So void melee, I made this function right here, void handle melee collision. Now it looks like a lot, but you've seen these parameters before. Again, if you're in Blueprint and you use the onComponentBegin overlap or onActorBegin overlap event, you'll notice it has all these things like the other actor, other component that overlapped with, if it comes from a sweep and what the result of the sweep was. So all these parameters come from the onComponentBegin overlap, and they're just going to be passed into this function. We actually need to set it up this way because when you call add dynamic, we have to pass in a function to be called, and it needs the proper parameters to pass along to that function. So it is a U function. Make sure you make this a U function, again, with add dynamic and actually passing that data along. If you don't, you will get a crash or an error. So we need to make sure that we keep this object and everything that's being passed along alive, which U function is going to accomplish for us. Call this whatever you want. I called it void handle melee collision. And for the parameters, we need a primitive component pointer, which is going to be the overlap component. Then we have a actor pointer for the other actor that was overlapped. Then we have U primitive component for the other component that was overlapped that we collided with. We have int32 other body index, bool b from sweep, and then const f hit result, reference or ampersand, sweep result, which is the result of the sweep. So go ahead and put those parameters in, and then once we have this function, we can go back to the FPS tutorial character.cpp, and we can make this line here, but of course we're going to have to create the handle melee collision function as well to actually get it building properly. So we have melee collision component, and we're going to bind onComponentBegin overlap. We're going to bind it by calling .add dynamic. So basically, once onComponentBegin overlap is called, we need the class or object that we're going to call this on, and then the actual function that we're going to be calling. If this component collides with something or overlaps with something, we're going to be calling it on this class. Really, this object, this FPS tutorial character, is the one that's going to handle that logic. So this keyword works. Then we need the actual function that we're going to be calling. You could do this from a different class or a different character, so you have to put in the class manually. So ampersand a FPS tutorial character, : and our new function, which is handle melee collision. As the comment says, when the component begins overlapping with something, call handle melee collision. Scroll down to where you want to create this. I'm going to create it right under our melee function, which is right here. So I'm making a new function, void AFPS tutorial character, : handle melee collision, and I'm using my same parameter list that I had. So our U primitive component, A actor, U primitive component, int32, boolean, and F hit result. So once we do detect a collision, the first thing I want to do, and the only thing I want to do right now, is check to see if the other actor we're colliding with is an enemy. We can do this by using other actor, so whatever actor we overlapped with when onComponentBegin overlap fired is getting put into this variable. If we cast other actor to a default enemy, if this succeeds, we will know that we hit an enemy, so we can make a variable instead equal to that. So auto hit enemy equals this cast. Put that all within an if statement. If hit enemy is valid, we know that we have an enemy, and it's going to be of type a default enemy. At this point, we can use hit enemy and call the take damage function that is in the default enemy class. Now default enemy.h previously had this take damage function. However, this function was in the protected section, which I want to call it from another class now, from our FPS tutorial character.cpp. So I've moved it from protected, and I put it right here in public. So make sure you make that adjustment if you were matching what I had. That way you can call it right here. and you can pass in an arbitrary damage amount right now. I made it 1.0 F, which is the entire enemy's health. If you go to defaultenemy.cpp, you can see where we set the default health value right here. But we need to enable collision on the melee collision component, and you can do that from a few places. I'm opting to do it as soon as we activate the melee function. This function gets called when we press the input to melee, not really when we enter the melee state. You could customize it to spawn it during part of the animation if you want. That would probably look nicer, but this way is more generic, so I'm doing it this way for now. So melee collision component, set collision enabled, and we're using eCollision enabled : query only. Additionally, to call take damage from the FPS tutorial character on top of moving the function to public, we need to include the default enemy.h and the FPS tutorial character. That way we can cast to it properly. So include default enemy.h. Now once that's done, we can go ahead and open up the editor. Now once we're in the editor, we can go to our character blueprint. So for me, it's in first person, character, base character BP. Once we're in here, we want to go to our viewport so we can see our character. And we should look for our melee collision component. Right here it's called melee collision component. You can see it's of type box collision. If we click on this, it should highlight an actual box component. At this point we can resize it, move it around, do all the stuff we want to do to determine where our melee is going to hit. So when I mentioned earlier determining the distance, here you go. You can customize your distance. Now you could actually attach this to something like your fist as well. We did that in the third person action RPG tutorial series. But I didn't want to do that for the FPS series because I don't want it to be based on that. I want to have a default area to perform collisions with melee, as some of my animations may be a little weird for the FPS, but I want the behavior to be consistent. So change this to your liking, size and all. Of course you could do this in the code as well, but it is easier within the editor like this so that you can see exactly where it's at. Now we have to disable the collision as well. So once the melee animation is done, we can disable it. You could do it in the code. I'm doing that one in the animation blueprint, so I do have the end of the animation already. If I go to my blueprints, animation blueprints, base character, and BP. In the previous episode, we created a melee ended event where we were disabling the Boolean for is using melee. At this point, pulled off my character reference, search for melee collision component. And I get that. And then I drag off of this and call set collision enabled. And I'm going to set it back to no collision. So once the melee is finished, we will no longer have any collision on that box component, and thus we won't be able to damage enemies. We can improve this even further. Here, where we're calling hit enemy take damage and passing in 1.0 F, we can actually make a variable and pass that variable in. So if our damage is going to be the same for every melee attack on our character, we can make a new variable, float melee damage, make it a U property. We'll give it edit anywhere, blueprint read write, so we can edit it and access it in the blueprint, with a category of melee. So the damage a successful melee attack deals. Once we've made this variable, we can go back into the CPP file and we can replace this 1.0 F with the melee damage variable. And we just want to set a default value for this. In our constructor, I'm going to set this value, melee damage, and it's going to equal whatever value we want. It can be 1.0 F. I'm actually going to make it 0.5 F. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for today's episode, so I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope this improved your melee attacks. If it did, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions to further support the channel and get some perks like these tutorials and series when they're finished and ready on the Epic Marketplace. If you had any issues following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and that support is completely free. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for you, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.